So you've made a coffee table, and now you want to make a matching TV stand. You've done it once before, you should have no problem, right? We'll see in the CavBot workshop. When it comes to woodworking or making in general, you could do something 1,000 times, have all the knowledge in the world, and still run into complications. But with this project, it seemed that I ran into issues every which way I turned. Even with doing things I've done before, I'm still learning and adjusting. So I'm gonna walk you guys through the process of building this, and I'll show you all the obstacles that I had to overcome. As usual, because it's cheaper, I start a project with rough sawn lumber and mill it down myself. For the TV stand, I started working on the top, and for this I'm joining together boards using dowels to help for alignment. While gluing the top up, I learned my lesson from my computer desk, and I decided to clamp it up one piece at a time so I didn't have to struggle like I did last time. One thing I love about wood is the natural defects. So I got this board and another board because they had voids that I will fill with resin. I just feel that it gives a piece a ton of character. With black resin on walnut, it's not much of a contrast, but it gives just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
To prepare for resin, I need to clear out this void of any loose pieces, and then I taped the underside and dammed off the edge. I'm using Total Boat 2:1 slow hardening resin with black liquid dye. After mixing it thoroughly, I started filling the void. This is the point where we first start running into issues. Alright, this is the next day. We sprung a leak. Luckily I put down this tarp so it didn't stick. I mean, learning experience, I gotta do a better job. I double taped this thing and it still sprung a leak, so I need to get more resin and I'll do a second pour. Hopefully it filled any hole that's under there, and then the next pour will just fill it up. Let's do it again. After the resin fully cured, I started flattening the top with my router and router sled. Since the dowels helped with the alignment, there wasn't much to take off, but I'm able to bring down the top to its final thickness. This is pretty quick work with a bit as beefy as this thing.
She's just a little beefy.
Now here's where we had another issue that came up. While flattening, I took too much off the top and the dowels got exposed. In hindsight, I should have aligned the dowels on the bottom side of the top or removed the bulk from the bottom. We're gonna fix that mistake later on.
I can fix that.
After the top is flattened, there are still lines by the router, so I'll use my drum sander to remove those lines. With an open end sander, you feed it through once, flip it around, and feed it through again. Now that the top is truly flat, I can cut it to final size. To match the coffee table design and to ensure the top won't cup, I am adding breadboard ends. There's a couple of different ways to make breadboard ends, and this is probably the less seen version. To match the coffee table, I'm making a tongue and groove, which means you'll see the joint on the edge of the table. You would most likely see other people hiding the joint with basically an elongated mortise and tenon. I did it this way on the coffee table because it's a lot less work and easier to do. With the dado stack on my table saw, I can cut a groove into the caps. Sending it through once and flipping it around will ensure that it is perfectly in the middle. For the tongue, I will use a router and a straight edge to give me a clean line for the shoulder and then hog out the waist. Once we have a nice fit, we can move on attaching the end. Off camera, I drilled holes, and then with the end back on, I can make a mark using a brad point bit. Then I came back and made another mark 1/16 of an inch closer to the shoulder. This is for something called draw boring, where the dowels that we're going to send through pulls the end in and gives it a tight seam with the shoulder. After the holes are drilled into the tongue, I use a file to elongate them so that the dowels can move with expansion and contraction of the tabletop. Just like the coffee table, I made my own dowels using Padauk and maple to give it a pop of color. With the center dowel, I will glue it completely in place, but for the outer two dowels, I will drive it most of the way through and then apply the glue at the end. This is so that the dowel is attached to the end, but not to the tongue, allowing for the table to move out and in from the middle. Now I'm going to show you how I fixed the issue with the exposed dowels. I decided a no-brainer solution would be to insert some decorative bow ties. For this, I'm using walnut wood to make them very subtle. I'm no expert when it comes to bow tie inlays, but I use them on my saddle bar stools. On these though, I took my time to have cleaner inlays. I used my table saw to make most of the cut and used my chisels to clean them up after. With the CA glue and tape trick, I'll temporarily attach the bow tie to the top so I can use a box cutter to score the wood. I can leave the rest of the tape behind as it will give me a clear view of what I need to cut out. With my router and a spiral upcut bit, I remove the majority of the material, and then with a sharp chisel, I can clean up the rest. Before I inserted the bow ties, I chamfered the edges so that it would go in easier. With a hand plane, I took off the excess and then used a sander to make it flush. The majority of these inlays came out flawless, but there were a couple that had tiny gaps that I filled with glue and sawdust, which made them completely disappear. I'm extremely happy with how much my inlays have improved. So much so I was shocked I was able to do them so well.
I feel shocked!
At this point, the top is nearly done, so we're going to transition on building the carcass. Besides a slight design change, I'm constructing the carcass so that it can be broken down before its final assembly. I'm doing this so I can transport the project. I have a perfectly logical explanation of why I'm doing this, but I'll explain that in a later video. That being said, if you like this content so far, why don't you just go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. You guys seem to like when I showed my SketchUp model as I went along, so I'll keep doing that to keep you up to speed. There's a lot of breaking down of material, and it's a lot easier to work with smaller pieces, so I cut apart my boards before I had them surfaced. When laying out my cut list, I like to color coordinate my pieces in SketchUp so I can keep track of everything, and this keeps it organized. With everything surfaced, I can start cutting them down to size. Here I'm cutting for the legs. Since the rails and stiles are all the same width, I can rip them all at the same size. After I made all the cuts, I made sure to label each piece with their corresponding color to keep track. Typically when I need to dial in a cut, I will practice on some scrap pieces of pine to get it just right before I make a cut on the expensive wood.
Smart.
With my dado stack and a table saw, I'll cut a dado into the rails, and like I did before, I'll make one cut and I'll flip it around to do the other so that it is perfectly in the middle. It is easier to cut all the dados before I cut the rails to their final length because it will give me less pieces to send through. If you thought we were done with issues on this project, you were wrong.
You were wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
Here's a fun tip about your tape measure. Don't drop it on the ground, because I dropped it on the ground and didn't see it, and it bent one of these guys backwards, and I did all my measurements for the rails with it while it was bent, and while it was bent in 1/8 of an inch, all my rails came out 1/8 of an inch short. So I fixed it and it's all good, but make sure you do that in the future. One good thing about it is that all of my rails were 1/8 of an inch short. If one of them or a couple of them were too short, then it would throw the entire thing off. But since they're all 1/8 of an inch short, I can just make modifications to my plans and I'm all good. Now that all the rails are cut, I can cut the 1/4 inch plywood down to size for the panels. One difference I did for the TV stand is that I sanded and finished the panels before assembling the sides. I figured this would be easier to do beforehand, but in reality, doing multiple rounds of finishing was more of a pain, and I would probably just assemble and finish it all at once at the end. For joinery on the panels, I'm using dowels on the pieces I can permanently assemble and pocket holes on others so I can assemble it later. Here's a little hiccup I ran into with the dowels that I'm going to try to explain the best I can. Since I'm using all dowels, these dowels here will intersect. This won't be a big issue as it'll have one full dowel and most of another to support the first joint. I did glue a piece into the dado so that it had more meat to grab onto though. Well, that issue aside, I can start assembling all the panels. This is one of the doors being assembled. After the glue dried, I glued a square peg into the exposed dado. You can avoid this by doing a stop dado, but this is much easier as no one will see it except if the door was open. The side panels can be permanently attached to the legs, so to align for the dowels, I laid them out on my bench and used some strips to raise them up 1/4 of an inch. Then I used some center finders to make marks on the legs to drill for the dowel holes. Before I glued up the panels to the legs, I put a slight chamfer on the bottom of the legs. This is so you don't get any tear out if it's ever dragged on the ground. For the back panel, I'm using pocket screws. I'm drilling this after because the hole is going partially through a dowel. I will be assembling the entire carcass before taking it all apart to move. The carcass consists of these two panels. To add these, it took a little more thinking from the coffee table as I just had to drop them in from the top. For this piece, I attached some support pieces on the left, right, and back and installed a front stretcher. Now I can start cutting panels for the bottom and for the shelf. Then I measured to cut out notches from the corner. This makes a pretty snug fit. Before I can work on the shelf, I need to make these verticals which will support the shelf and divide the lower section for the drawers and the cabinets. To cover up the end of the plywood, I cut some thin strips to edge band. Then with a block plane and sander, I flushed it up. So the shelf is supported in the center provided by the two verticals, but the edges and the corners need something so the shelf doesn't sag. I accounted for this in my design by adding some pieces on the inside. I felt the easiest way to install these would be to get the shelf installed and then use some scrap pieces the same height as the verticals to hold the shelf level so I could glue the pieces into place. I'm not gluing these pieces into place yet because I have to remove the bottom panel, but I will keep the scrap pieces in that are holding up the shelf so I can measure for the doors. Now the doors I made beforehand with the rest of the panels, I just have to shave off a little to make them fit. I wanted them to sit back some, so I ran them through my drum sander to make them thinner. With the doors done, I can work on the drawers. These are made like all the other drawers I make, using 1/2-inch ply, cutting in dados to accept the bottoms, and assembling with pocket holes. Rather than having hardware like I did on the coffee table, I decided to go with push-to-open drawers and doors. As you can see here, I had some issues with the bottom drawer that I'll fix later on off camera. For the false drawer fronts, I'm going with a plain flat front that I can attach from the inside. To make push-to-open cabinet doors, I found these pieces that you can insert into the verticals, and with a spring it pushes open the door. At this point, everything is constructed. So now I'll take it all apart for easier finishing and transport. As you saw before, I finished the panels before assembling the sides. I learned from my last time of making shaker style panels for easier finishing, but to be honest, unless I'm finishing everything before assembly, I really don't think I'm saving much time. For the coffee table and my executive desk build, I used aqua coat to fill in the grain and give a smooth finish, so I decided to do the same on this project. This is simple to use. With a flexible card or a putty knife, press the gel in going across the grain and then scrape off the excess going with the grain. Once it is dry, you can sand it smooth with a high grit sandpaper before finish. It's been quite a while since we had something go wrong. Well, let's add another one to the list.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
If you don't sand properly, you'll leave behind some of the aqua coat, and you will be able to see the discoloration when you apply the finish. You can't see it that well on camera, but you can definitely see it in person. If you're a complete dum-dum and sanded like me, you'll have lots of spots that you have to focus on and fix. Now with that properly sanded, I can reapply the first coat of finish, and this time it looks much better. After a few coats, we are finally ready for assembly. You'll notice that I didn't put finish in a couple of places. This is because I have to glue in those supports. Here I'm building out the side some for door hinges. When installing the shelf, there is a gap. Rather than trying to cut the shelf and fit it in perfect, I'm just adding some trim to cover up the gap. I figured that this wasn't going to be seen that much, so instead of doing extra work, I can just cover it up.
How selfish of me. Let's do all the things that you want to do.
I'm drilling a hole here for wires to feed. With a small pilot hole, I can start drilling on one side and then finish on the other side to avoid tear out. To attach the top, I'm using Z-clips for the seasonal movement. If you're ever working in a tough spot like I am, I align the top with some painter's tape as a guide, marked where I need to drill for the screws, and then attach the Z-clips facing inward. When the top is back in place, you just have to loosen the screw, rotate the clip around, and tighten it back up. That way you're not dropping the screws and struggling with it. I wanted to use this project not to just poke fun at all the mistakes I made, but to show you guys how to overcome those obstacles if they arise. People will not notice most mistakes, but it is important to know how to fix them. And if you're ever worried, just don't point out your mistakes and they'll probably go unseen. Even though I had some issues on this project, it turned out to be a beautiful piece. It's not exactly the same as the coffee table, but these two together make a great set. If you like this project and you want to see more like it, I have a couple more loaded up for you right over here. Do me a favor to like and share this video because it really helps the channel grow. That's all I have for you guys this time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time in the Cabot Workshop. Oh, every time.